Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. When this magazine was founded in 1970 by Samuel Huntington, then a professor at Harvard University, it had a very influential founding board, including other scholars such as Stanley Hoffman and Joe Nye. And that board of luminaries also included a certain Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Polish immigrant who came to America via Canada and rose to prominence as a scholar at Harvard and then later at Columbia. Brzezinski went on to become President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and one of the most influential foreign policy figures in American history. Like most great stories, Brzezinski's wasn't linear, and it wasn't without great struggle. There's a lot to learn not only from his work and ideas, but also how they shaped America and the world. Well, Brzezinski's life is now the subject of a great new biography called, quite simply, Zbig. The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet. Its author is the FT columnist and US national editor, Edward Luce, who joins me now. Ed, welcome back to FP Live.
It's a delight to be with you, Ravi.
And really, I should say this at the outset, congrats on the book. It's a huge accomplishment. I thought it was a real page turner.
That's really kind of you. I mean, it was the most significant and exciting project of my life, and I hope that somehow came through in the prose.
It really does. So I'm going to start with a very easy question. I'm sure you get it all the time. Why Brzezinski?
Well, partly because his family came to me with these diaries that he kept when he was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, which are spoken into his dictaphone every night in sort of perfectly formed paragraphs and deal with, these extraordinary events that happened in that very geopolitical decade, the 1970s, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Camp David Agreement, the first time an Arab country, Egypt, had recognized Israel, the return of the Panama Canal to Panama, talking of sort of current echoes, um, the Soviet non-invasion of Poland, the normalization of relations with China, the Iranian hostage crisis, and so on. And this is gripping first draft of history stuff. And I made sure that it was offered to me without strings so that the family would only read whatever I produced at the same time as everybody else. But then once I started delving into his actual life, the full life rather than just the public figure that people in Washington know, it became even more gripping because a biography is about the making of the person behind all the reasons we're reading about that person. And Brzezinski's life, from interwar Warsaw, interbellum Europe, to the first few months when he died of Trump's presidency in May 2017. This is an extraordinary cinematic arc and an incredible story to tell, first and foremost, as a story.
I thought so too. And, we'll get to the policy, but, through his own diaries, which you had access to, and then the family letters from his mother, from his wife, all these other figures who were important in his life, you really end up painting a picture of, a man who had this incredible life and a very difficult life as well, growing up in Poland and then having to come to North America, Canada first, and then the United States. Um, as you look back at all the things you unearthed about him, what surprised you the most that you didn't know before?
So I think his relationship with Pope John Paul II, I mean, I was aware that there'd been a relationship. I wasn't aware of quite how consequential it was. And of course, this was the first Polish Pope ever and the first non-Italian in 453 years. And Brzezinski already knew him as a prelate in Poland. And of course, they'd met and talked in Polish. And I managed to get hold of enormous amount of letters that they exchanged, mostly in Polish, but also notes of long meetings they had. And it was very funny because the first time they really sort of got to talk after the Pope had been elected, which was in 1978, He came to America the following year, had a session with Carter. Brzezinski was there, and then Brzezinski was invited with his family to dinner at the Vatican embassy here in Washington. And Brzezinski quips that, Carter's more like a religious leader and the Pope's more like a world statesman. And the Pope, in almost every letter they exchanged since then, reminds Brzezinski of that joke because he thought it was really funny. And then there is just the other thing that they used to quip about in amongst these very geopolitical conversations they'd have about what was going on behind the Iron Curtain was that the KGB thought Brzezinski had arranged, somehow rigged the conclave to get Pope John Paul II elected. And so whenever they met each other, the Pope would say, "Ah, you're the one who got me elected." There wasn't any basis to that conspiracy theory, but it was a KGB report. So
Right.
I found that fascinating. But to be honest, Ravi, I found so much fascinating in terms of the material I got, the Polish secret police files that were kept on Brzezinski in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Um, the extraordinary sort of quality of his diary, which is very, very opinionated. This was a sharp elbowed guy, but with very acute observations of events and people. The private, sometimes really intrusive, is a biography you feel like you really are rummaging in people's deepest
Yeah.
recesses, but you need to as a biographer in order to explain the person in full. But the love letters, the private diaries that he kept as a child, his mother's extraordinarily lyrical diaries. His parents really came from a vanished Habsburg world, um, and so much more. I mean, it really was an extraordinary rich dive into primary material that hadn't been used before.
Mm. And, as we sort of work our way towards Zbig, the policymaker, Zbig, the academic, tell us a little bit about his early life. So, comes to Canada, he's 10 or 11 years old, he's a remarkable student, learning languages quickly, doing well at school, assimilates nicely, but in many senses, Ed, his mind is still very much shaped by what's going on in Europe.
Yeah, there was a bunch of school books I got, yearbooks, from his early years in Canada. So he's 12 for the first of them, and which is in 1940. He'd been born in Warsaw in 1928, and he's there, non-English speaker, washing up on Canada's shores. Um, and at the end of his first year, he wins first prize in English and English poetry. So English literature and English poetry, both first prizes in an Anglophone school, even though this is in Montreal. And the yearbook, all the kids are asked to list their sort of favorite activities, and they take it in very, I guess, Anglophonic, ironic spirit. And they write things like yawning, teasing my grandmother, kicking a football, whatever it might be. And Brzezinski puts Europe,
Yeah.
foreign affairs.
I thought
Um,
that was hilarious.
and, remember, this is early into the Second World War, and this is the Second World War, but that begins and is really dominated in its first year by the incineration of Poland, Brzezinski's home country, that he had left 18 months earlier, well, actually less, that he left a year earlier, just after the Munich Agreement, the notorious Munich Agreement had been agreed between Chamberlain and Hitler, giving away the Sudetenland to the Nazis. And he every night would listen in the first few weeks of the Second World War to Radio Warsaw. And
Mm.
it went silent after a couple of weeks, except for the first 11 notes of a Polonaise by Chopin, by the Polish composer. And one night, it was replaced by Deutschland über alles, which was like a guillotine coming down, even more than the sort of stories of the incineration of Warsaw and all the streets they knew, and was listening to Deutschland über alles. And uh, that sense of wounded Polishness and of I guess the last cavalry charge of history, because that happened then in 1940, was always present within. There was always a cavalry charge in Brzezinski's persona, in his character. He would go straight for opponents or enemies. There was nothing wily or deceptive about him. And I think the history of Poland and his sense of anguish over a sort of lost nation that he burned to regain. That was really what I describe as the motivating boost for his life.